Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. And so I will start without further ado by giving you my core thesis away, which is that there are multiple inequalities related to transport, not just one kind. And in a car-dependent society such as Germany, amongst others, most of them have to do with the car. And as a result, the impact of Verkehrswende policies will be multifaceted and contradictory in a way. But this stands in stark contrast with the public and political debate, where only some of these inequalities are emphasized, while others are very much overlooked. Often, I would argue, this is my personal argument, by actors who are interested more than anything in preserving the status quo, more than in the inequalities themselves. And this situation of selective consideration of transport inequalities tends to result in unfair outcomes. So I will start a little bit in a slightly academic way by a couple of years ago with some colleagues, we wrote this paper about transport poverty, which is a broad umbrella concept which is used to point to all kinds of transport inequalities related to transport. And we argued that there are like 4 dimensions of it. And I will go through them very briefly. First one, if mobility poverty is a lack of access to transport resources such as cars and public transport. Second one is more related to affordability. For one, accessibility poverty is related to other reasons for lack of accessibility, which are not related to transport resources. And the fourth one is exposure to transport externalities, which are unequally distributed as well. So my presentation is sort of structured around these 4 dimensions. So I will start by what we call mobility poverty, so lack of access to transport resources. And obviously the key transport resource in a car-dependent society is the car. And something which is often overlooked is that roughly 20% of German households do not have access to a car. But this is very unequally distributed. So among the lowest income band, it's more than 53%. And even in the low income band, it's 37%. So it's often, in the public debate, I have the impression that it's often, the case is often made implicitly that all of us have access to cars and use them sort of in the same way, but some of us have lower income and therefore they will be disadvantaged. Well, that's not entirely correct. There are actually a lot of us, especially in the lower income bands, who do not have access to cars. And there are many reasons for that, but one important reason is that some people just can't afford having a car. And roughly 5% of German households don't say that they don't have a car because they can't afford it. But this is 25% among people in poverty, so below 60% of the median income. And this percentage is decreasing over time, as you can see, but not that fast. So why does that matter? Well, unfortunately, all we know from transport research, there's consensus that actually the car outperforms other modes in terms of access to things like employment. People without a car find it harder to find employment, and also constrains participation in lack of a car, constrains participation in other social activities, such as even things like visiting relatives. It has been found. But of course, this is highly variable across space. So in cities, we will have more people without cars, with a mild disadvantage in terms of accessibility. And that explains why we see in large cities like Berlin, even household types such as people with children, families with children who decide not to have a car. Whereas in sparsely populated areas, you have very few people without a car, but they suffer from a very severe disadvantage because of it. And that explains why it's just older people or the unemployed or the disabled who go without a car in those kind of spaces. Which brings me to the second dimension, which is transport affordability. So in car-dependent contexts, in car-dependent spaces especially, low-income households are under a lot of pressure to own and use cars, despite the fact that these demand a substantial economic investment. And as a result, they face a sort of trade-off between either curtailing their mobility or cutting expenditure in other areas. And in most cases, they will do both. So this is something which in the debate, in international debate, is often referred to as forced car ownership or Zwangsmotorisierung in Germany. And I've done a study on this, finding that roughly 5% of German households fall into this category, but 10% in the lowest income quintile. But it's very much a rural phenomenon, at least here in Germany. So it's 7% of households in rural areas, but just 3% in urban areas. And I suppose it would be something even lower in a city like Berlin. So we find pretty high levels of social exclusion, material deprivation, indebtedness, and even domestic energy poverty among these households. But they are slightly different from other low-income houses, so that they can be described as living on the edges of social inclusion. So they often working poor, but working poor, but having a mortgage or trying to get a house, to buy a house, and so on. So they have a particular research, social demographic profile. And there's other research which I and others have conducted, suggesting that these houses suffer, particularly when fuel prices increase. They have a pretty inelastic demand for fuel. So if fuel prices increase, they tend to match that up with more demand. And this is, of course, a group that we hear a lot about when we hear about the yellow vests, about the danger of a yellow vest movement rising in Germany if we introduce certain kinds of taxes and so on. But what about the affordability of public transport? Well, there are problems there as well. This is from a recent report by the European Commission, finding that the share of households who find that they cannot afford regular use of public transport is pretty high in Germany compared to other countries, around 5% among the population as a whole, and around 10% among the poor. And this might be surprising to some of you. It was surprising to me as well when I found it. But when you look into it, I'm not aware of any comprehensive study that has looked into the reasons for that. But if you look into it, there are some reasons. Actually, we know that public transport fares have increased more rapidly than other goods since the 90s. And particularly the introduction of the Verkehrswende since the 90s as well has been great in many ways, but it appears to have been accompanied by an increase in fares. For example, 46% in München, inflation adjusted, or 33% in the Rhine-Ruhr. There are, of course, social ticket schemes in some cities, but it has been found that they are often more expensive than what is allocated to transport in hard spheres. So that puts households in a difficult situation. Working poor are not eligible. And as such, qualitative research has found that many low-income households actually struggle to decide to forego the social ticket to buy single tickets, which is, of course, on the long term more expensive, and to walk or cycle, perhaps to an extent that is not necessarily healthy, and or foregoing trips entirely, or cutting on other necessities, such as, for example, domestic heating or things like that. So the third point is about, so here I would have like the accessibility poverty, which is a very broad category, just to point to the fact that there are other reasons other than access to tangible transport resources, which can put people in a difficult situation with regard to access. And this is a very broad category, and I will just illustrate this with something which I believe should perhaps is a bit overlooked, which is travel-related time poverty. So the idea that some people invest too much time in transport and travel, and that leads them to miss out on other important activities, which is often related to long commutes with motorized modes. And research shows that this is associated with a lot of adverse effects, such as less social support, higher separation rates, lower fertility, negative health outcomes, and so on. And this is a problem that tends to affect people who are not typically socially excluded, such as men, full-time employed, people with higher income and education level, who might be, in some cases, work rich but time poor. But it can be an issue for carless households, people in large metropolitan areas as well. So living without a car in a large city like Berlin is possible, but you might end up like spending a lot of time on traveling by public transport to places. And that can have a negative impact. So we don't know much about this phenomenon, but we do know that the share of Germans who take a rather long time to travel to work is increasing since the 90s. So it was just 20% who took more than 30 minutes one way in the 1990, and it's like 27% now, and even higher, like something like 30% among men. So this is also something to think about, I would argue. So the third dimension is exposure to externalities. As we've heard that there are many of them: climate change, noise, road safety, you name it. I will focus here on traffic-related air pollution. And the thing with those is that we tend to think of these as environmental problems, but I would argue that they are social problems as well, that there is strong inequalities in who is affected by these, by things like air pollution. So they're not just public health and environmental issue, but social inequality problems as well. And there was recently a review by the Umweltbundesamt finding that actually low-income individuals tend to be more exposed to air pollution in Germany. And often there's a pattern of environmental injustice, whereby the most exposed are precisely people with low income, without cars, who live in city centers, who contribute the least to the problem, and actually suffer most from the consequences. So this is a clear pattern of unfairness there. And I just wanted to illustrate this with a map of a recent study from Dortmund, where I am based, which shows, like in red, the areas of socioeconomic disadvantage, which, if you know Dortmund, would be like around the Nordstadt, which are also areas of where people with migration background tend to live. And the second map, the areas with the highest concentrations of particulate matter. So you see that the two overlap almost completely. And yet when we discuss these problems, we tend to discuss of like air pollution as something which hits us all sort of in the same way, whereas it's pretty strongly and equally patterned. So to conclude, so we've seen that there are multiple impacts, multiple dimensions of inequality related to transport. And that implies, I would argue, that the impact of any Verkehrswende policy will be similarly multiple and possibly contradictory. So what I've tried to do here is a sort of mental experiment of thinking about what would be the impact of say, introducing a CO2 tax on these different dimensions, but it would look pretty similar if we were to talk about like increasing parking prices, for example. So first of all, some low-income people really rely on cars to get to work, and spend disproportionate amounts on car use already, and they would need to spend even more. And that's part of, and we hear a lot about that when we talk about CO2 taxes, but what we hear less about is that many low-income people have no car at all. And if we redistribute like the revenue of CO2 taxes, these groups might even benefit if, for example, we use that revenue to make public transport cheaper. That might solve some of the problems I've highlighted with the affordability of public transport. And hopefully, I mean, when you introduce a CO2 tax, you also sort of hope that that will result in, to some extent, in modal shift. So some people might shift to car from public transport, but that might increase the duration of their commute, and some people might end up being time poor as a result. That's also something to consider. But on the other hand, low-income groups are the most exposed to pollution, and a CO2 tax would reduce traffic mileage and emissions, and they would benefit the most from the air quality improvement. So all of these things are happening at the same time, and it's sort of difficult to just like summarize that into a single number, which says whether measure is regressive or not. So to conclude, I think that more than anything, we need a better framing when it comes to debating how the Verkehrswende impacts on inequalities. So the current framing is selective. It prioritizes some dimensions of inequality, most of all issues related to the transport, to the affordability of car use. And we need a more holistic approach where we look at the multiple dimensions. Because if we leave some out, the results will be unfair. And the current framing sets environmental versus social issues, but only some of them. Whereas I would argue that all of these, also the environmental ones, are social issues which entail, which have an important distributional dimension. And also, I think it is important to avoid the very widespread winners and losers framing. So we introduce a new measures and we think, oh, who are the winners and losers of this measure? But that sort of implies or assumes that the status quo is fair, right? And as we've seen, the status quo is not fair. There are some groups that are losing out already, such as those low-income people in city center breathing a lot of particulate matter as a result of other people driving, richer people driving around them. So this is really a framing that should be avoided, in my opinion. And with that, I hope I was within time, and I will. Vielen Dank.
Ganz herzlichen Dank für diesen spannenden Input, Herr Mattioli. Da war ja viel Food for Thought drin. Ich schaue mal ins Publikum, ob es dazu eine Rückfrage oder Anmerkung gibt. Das scheint nicht der Fall zu sein. Dann springe ich da noch mal rein. Und zwar würde ich gerne wissen, ob Sie ein Bauchgefühl, eine Einschätzung haben zum Thema Verkehr auf dem Land und die Zwangsmotorisierung, den Begriff kannte ich auch noch nicht für heute, ob und in welchem Umfang innovative Sharing-Konzepte und Ähnliches helfen können, das ein Stück weit abzupuffern.
Ja, also das ist schwere Frage. Das ist oft diskutiert, ob Sharing-Konzepte helfen können. Mein Zweifel ist, dass bisher Sharing-Konzepte sind profitabel eigentlich in den Stadtzentren, wo eigentlich eine Konzentration von Nutzer gibt. Und sie werden natürlich weniger profitabel im ländlichen Raum. So, wir brauchen vielleicht eine subventionierte oder eine von der Stadt gesteuert Sharing-Konzepte, aber wie es bisher der Fall war, es war meistens von privaten Unternehmen gesteuert und ja, dieses Modell würde nicht auf dem Land nicht unbedingt gut gehen. Ja.
Deswegen hatte ich nach innovativ gefragt, weil tatsächlich, da müsste man sich natürlich noch ein bisschen auch bei den Ansätzen was Neues ausdenken. Ich bekomme ein Signal von hinten. Wir haben eine Frage aus dem Chat. Ja, bitte. Oh, auch eine sehr gute Frage. Haben Sie gehört? Ich sage es nochmal so, dass es alle hören können. Welche Ansätze gibt es in anderen Ländern für eine gerechtere Verkehrs- und Mobilitätsstruktur? Wissen Sie dazu was?
Ja, ich glaube, alle Länder haben dieses Probleme und manche Länder haben dagegen nicht viel gemacht. Also ich könnte einen ähnlichen Vertrag in Großbritannien geben, ich war lange in Großbritannien, aber ich würde sagen, vielleicht in anderen Ländern, wie zum Beispiel in Großbritannien, diese Ungleichheiten sind, oder Verkehrsarmut, Mobilitätsarmut, wie wir das nennen, es gibt eine größere Wahrnehmung von diesen Problemen und ich habe oft den Eindruck, dass hier in Deutschland ein bisschen, wie auch Energiearmut, dieses Thema ist ein bisschen am Rand oder vergessen und viele sagen sogar, ja, aber wir haben dieses Problem nicht hier, weil wir haben schon ein starkes Sozialstaat und Hartz IV und genau. Und ich glaube, die Wahrnehmung fehlt ein bisschen, dass das ein Thema ist, aber mehr positiv. Es gab zum Beispiel in Großbritannien seit vielen Jahren dieses Accessibility Planning Ansatz, wo sie wirklich versuchen, die Planungssysteme einzurichten, sodass alle eine gute Erreichbarkeit zu verschiedenen Einrichtungen haben. Ein bisschen in Richtung von Daseinsvorsorge, würde man hier sagen. Aber es gibt bestimmt vieles, das man von anderen Ländern da lernen kann. Ja.
Ja, sehr spannend. Dazu vielleicht noch die letzte Frage. Die Wahrnehmung haben Sie ja in Ihrer Zusammenfassung auch nochmal dargestellt, dass es empfehlenswert wäre, Sinn machen würde, die verschiedenen Dimensionen der Optimierung und Gerechtigkeit und dergleichen zu betrachten, wenn man Politikmaßnahmen designt. In meiner persönlichen Wahrnehmung dieser klassische Fall von Time Poor, den Sie beschrieben haben, also ein wahrscheinlich Mann mittleren Alters, der gar nicht schlecht verdient, aber halt einfach einen weiteren Pendelweg hat. Meine These, werfe ich mal in den Raum, ist, dass der sich wahrscheinlich gar nicht als benachteiligt oder ungerecht behandelt unbedingt fühlt, gerade wenn es ein besser bezahlter Job ist, der ihm wahrscheinlich auch noch wichtig ist und Ähnliches. Also die Wahrnehmung überhaupt von diesen verschiedenen Inequality Dimensions. Gibt es dazu Best Practices oder Hintergründe, wie man die sozusagen, die muss ja zuerst stattfinden, damit das auch in der Politik als relevanter Faktor ankommen kann. Können Sie dazu noch was sagen?
Nicht wirklich. Aber was ich zu diesem Thema vielleicht sagen kann, ist, dass ich finde, es könnte auch strittig, also ich habe in dem Vortrag nicht gesagt, es könnte auch strittig sein, ob diese Personen wirklich benachteiligt sind. Weil man könnte sein, naja, wenn du ganz weit weg von Berlin wohnst, das war deine eigene Entscheidung, dass du dann jeden Tag mehr als eine Stunde fahren musst mit deinem Auto. Und warum solltest du als benachteiligt ich glaube, diese ganze Ungleichheit und Unfairness-Themen können sehr strittig werden und es gibt nichts Falsches damit, aber wir sollen diese Debatte mehr haben und auch uns vielleicht mehr streiten, ob ja, das ist nicht Benachteiligung und das ist schon und nicht uns zurückhalten von alle diese verschiedenen Dimensionen zu nennen und zu wahrnehmen. Ja, weil bisher nur ein paar davon oder nur eine steht in die öffentliche Debatte und die anderen gar nichts.
Wunderbar, ganz herzlichen Dank, Herr Dr. Mattioli. Jetzt kommt hier noch eine Frage, darf ich Sie vielleicht auf die Kaffeepause verweisen? Ich glaube, das finden Sie im Nachgang dann. Entweder schicken wir es rum oder wir können es sogar auf unsere Website stellen. Vielen Dank, Herr Mattioli.